morning. I'm going to read this from the New King James Version because that's where I'm most familiar. Beginning chapter 4, Deuteronomy 31 through 39. For the Lord your God is a merciful God. He will not forsake you nor destroy you, nor forget the covenant of your fathers which he swore to them. Now 32. For ask now concerning the days that are past, which were before you, since the day that God created man on earth, and ask from one end of the heaven to the other, whether any great thing like this has happened, or anything like it has been heard. Did any people ever hear the voice of God speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and lived? Or did God ever try to go and take for himself a nation from the midst of another nation, by trials, by signs, by wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt, before your eyes? To you it was shown that you might know that the Lord himself is God, and there is none others beside him. Out of heaven he let you hear his voice, that he might instruct you. On the earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words out of the midst of the fire. And because he loved your fathers, therefore he chose their descendants after them. And he brought them out of Egypt with his presence and with his mighty power, driving out from before you nations greater and mightier than you, to bring you in, to give you and their land as inheritance, as it is this day. Therefore know this day and consider it in your heart, that the Lord himself is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. There is no other.
Good morning. Again, appreciate that you are here today, and that hopefully as we are kind of getting into our topic for the year, the idea of love is kind of our overarching topic, and then for this first quarter, the idea that God loves us. And last week was indeed an introduction, and that introduction basically continues today before we get into the kind of the meat of the lessons, or the crux of the idea of God loving us and what that means for us and what we do with that idea that we serve a loving God. We really need to kind of lay some groundwork ahead of those types of lessons so that they can have the impact that they need to have upon us. And so we continue the introductory material today with the idea of kind of looking at a history of God's love as it's presented through scriptures, because sometimes we end up or falling victim to the idea that, you know, there's a God of the Old Testament and a God of the New Testament, and the God of the Old Testament is this, you know, this fearsome and vile sort of creature that just sits upon a throne of power and looks for ways that he can inflict judgment and wrath upon people that dare cross him. Versus a God of the New Testament that's like the antithesis of that God, that really there are two different gods presented in the Bible. But the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament are one and the same. We serve the God that is the Creator God. We serve the one true God, and there is no difference in character, there is no difference in attributes between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament. There are some differences in expression of those things and some differences in his expectations for his followers as a result of the expressions of his love. But we serve the Creator God of Genesis chapter 1. We serve the God who appeared to Moses in the burning bush on Mount Sinai. We serve the God who delivered the Egyptians, or the Israelites, from Egyptian captivity. We serve the God of David. We serve the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. We serve the God of Solomon. We serve the God of Isaiah and Elijah and we serve the God of the New Testament as well. He is one and the same. And for us to have an appropriate picture of who that God is, we need to understand his love going all the way back to the very beginning, and seeing that theme of love, that characteristic of love, that idea that God is love, as we talked about last week, that it's not just something that God possesses, but it's something that God is, that has been part of who he is from time immemorial, from eternity going backwards, and for us, eternity going forwards as well. And so God is God. God is love. He always has been, and he always will be love. And so we need to understand how that characteristic of who he is fits within the broader picture, the story of God that we have as presented by the Scriptures. So again, as sort of like we did last week, where we kind of just threw out some thoughts, and we introduced some things, and we understand that we're going to take the time to sort of answer some of those questions as we proceed through this study. We may do some more of that today, where we just kind of drop some things out there and say, okay, here's what it says. Now that you know it says that, we'll come back and we'll visit that again later as we move through the study of God's love for us. So let's do that. We want to establish God's credentials as a God who loves, because if this God of the New Testament that we serve presents himself as being a loving God in the Old Testament, in the New Testament, but he has done things that are uncharacteristic of love, or he exists in a way that contradicts that idea of him being a loving God at some other time and in some other place, then, well, that's a character flaw. That's a problem for us. If he comes along as a God who wants to reinvent himself as a God of love after existing in a way that doesn't demonstrate love early on, well, I'm not sure that that's a God that we can trust. I'm not sure that's a God that is the God that we really want to give ourselves to, if he can change, if he can decide, you know what, this isn't working out for me, and I'm going to reinvent myself and be something different, or I'm going to be a different God from here on out. That's a big problem. And so we want to see God's credentials as a God who loves. And so we start with the idea that God was a loving God, and he displayed that love through the patriarchs. And I did the preacher thing this morning where we have, the 3 points. I've got the alliteration in there, so we got the display and the declared and the demonstrated, so that it helps you remember it. Honestly, we could probably rearrange those words and make them match up with each of the 3 points. God's love is on display, and it's declared and it's demonstrated in each of the areas that we'll talk about. But those were 3 words that fit with the scriptures that we'll be using, and it fit with the ideas as well. So if I start saying in the first point that God has declared his love, I'm not wrong. I'm just saying it backwards, if that makes sense. So we can kind of rearrange those if we want. Where was I? Here we go. The patriarchs present for us a picture of God's love on display. And the passage that Mike read just a moment ago, I appreciate that, from Deuteronomy chapter 4, really lays some of those things out for us. And I won't go back and reread that, but let's just kind of go back and visit that passage again and look at some of the things that Moses says there as he is talking to the congregation before they enter into the promised land. And he asks some questions. He says, he starts out by saying, has anything like this ever happened before? Go back through the histories, go back through the stories that you remember of people interacting with their gods, and think about whether or not this has ever happened. Has it ever happened that a people has heard the voice of their God from the fire, as they did, as the Israelites had heard the voice of God from atop Mount Sinai back in Exodus chapter 19, when God descended upon the mountain in a cloud and in fire, and they heard his voice rumbling from the top of the mountain, and the people said, Moses, you go talk to him. We're scared to death. Has that ever happened before? Has it ever happened that a people have heard the voice of God? Has it ever happened that a God has rescued his chosen nation from the throes of captivity from a dominant, powerful military nation? Well, I'm certain if you go back and look in history, there's been times when people have escaped from slavery, perhaps before this, but has there ever been a time when a nation was so completely subjugated, so completely overthrown, completely under the control of another nation, and yet their God delivered them from that slavery? It's never happened before. Has there ever been a time that ruling army, that nation that was so powerful and so in control, that their army was destroyed in one mighty battle by a nation who could not stand before them? Has this ever happened? Has it ever happened that a nation has been led by a God who let them hear his voice from the heavens, who demonstrated himself to them, who showed himself to them in the cloud by day and in the fire by night? Has this ever happened before? And Moses is pointing to all of these things, and he's saying, look at this God that has led us out of captivity. Look at this God that has chosen our nation, that has given us these examples of what he is willing to do for us. And then he says this. He says, do you know why? Do you know why God has done this? Do you know why God has presented himself in this way? Do you know why God has delivered us in the way that he has delivered us? He says in verse 37, because he loved your fathers. Do you remember the relationship that God had with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob? Do you remember the intimate knowledge that they had of the God who called them out of their homes to serve him and to follow him? Do you remember that relationship that God had with these fathers? God remembered it. God remembered the love that he had for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he displayed that love to the patriarchs through the way that he treated their descendants, through the way that he treated the nation of Israel. Why did God do all of these things and present himself to the nation of Israel? Because he loved their fathers. Everything that he did for Israel, he did for love. Moses goes on in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 7 through 9, and he says, he kind of follows this theme of the idea of God loving the fathers. He says, chapter 7, verses 7 through 9, the Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you because you were more in number than any of the people, for you were fewest of all the people. But because the Lord God loved you and kept the oath which he swore to your fathers, the Lord brought you out by a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of slavery, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know therefore that the Lord your God, he is God, the faithful God, who keeps his covenant and his loving kindness to 1,000th generation with those who love him and keep his commandment. Moses said, you know what? God did these things for you not because you were already a mighty and great nation. No, in fact, you are one of the lowest of nations. You think of the position they were in. They were in utter subjugation and utter slavery to the Egyptians. They had no status on their own whatsoever, and God still chose them. Why did he choose them? Because he loved them. Why did he love them? Because he had loved their fathers, and that love transferred from one generation to the next. God remembered the love that he had for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he brought that love forward in time to loving their descendants as well. God displayed his love by choosing Israel when they were at their weakest. And by this display of love, the Israelites then were to know God. That was their impetus, their reason, their motive for getting to know the God who had rescued them, because he had displayed his love for them. Look also at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 14 and 15. Try to wrap your minds around this idea. Deuteronomy 10, 14 and 15. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did the Lord set his affection to love them, and he chose their descendants after them, even you above all peoples, as it is to this day. God, who is the sovereign creator of all of the universe, God who has at his disposal every molecule of every atom that has been created. Did I say that backwards? Every atom of every molecule that's been invented. God has at his disposal those things. He can choose anything he wants to choose. And what did he do? He chose Israel because he loved them. The God who is sovereign, the God who sits on a throne that we can't even imagine, chose to display his love to a nation of slaves because he had chosen to love their fathers. God's love is on display through the way that he treats his chosen people in the Old Testament. This God who is the God of love, the God who is love that we know of in the New Testament, that we know of in our relationship through his Son, it's the same God. It's the same love. God is love even in the time of the patriarchs. But God was love also not just in the time of the patriarchs, but also during the time of the reign of the Israelite nation. During that dispensation of time, during the time of the Old Testament, we could look at lots and lots of different examples. I've chosen one, and we'll go back and we'll look at other examples as we undertake the rest of this study. But one of the greatest displays of love, or one of the greatest illustrations of God's love, I think, in all of the Old Testament is found in the book of Hosea. Hosea was what we call one of the minor prophets, not because he was minor in stature or minor in importance, but just because his book is a little shorter than some of the others. And so one of the minor prophets by the name of Hosea, who is a single man at the beginning of the book, but he is commanded by God to go and take a wife. And not just any wife, but he's commanded to go and take a wife who was a prostitute. And in order to do so, Hosea didn't just get to go find a woman on the streets and marry her, but he had to go buy her out of prostitution. He had to go to her masters who were selling her on the streets, and he had to purchase her from them, take her from them, and make her his wife, and with her establish then a home and have children with her. And then, do you know how she rewarded that love that he displayed for her? She sold herself back into prostitution. She went back to her old masters, and she enslaved herself to them once again. And Hosea went and he purchased her again. He bought her out of prostitution a second time, and he brought her back to be his wife once again. And that is a model, it's a representation of God's love for the Israelite nation. And we have this amazing chapter in Hosea, chapter 11. It's a poetic declaration of God's love for his people. Hosea chapter 11, we won't read the whole thing, but just the first 4 verses to begin. He says, "When Israel was a youth, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they called them, the more they went from them. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and burning incense to idols. Yet it is I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with the cords of a man, with bonds of love, and I became to them as one who lifts the yoke from their jaws. And I bent down and I fed them." See, after reading the story of Hosea and what he did to purchase his wife out of prostitution and to provide for her a home, to redeem her from her slave masters, to give her a status that she never could have had on her own, to give her the security, to give her a future, a family, a home, and then for her to sell herself back into prostitution, to forsake all those things that Hosea had provided for her, and to go back and to choose to live a life of slavery once again, only to have Hosea come and provide all of those same things over again. It's a model of what God has done. God says, I called my son Ephraim, who I loved. I called him out of slavery to Egypt, and I provided for him a way of escape. I provided for him a home and a future and a redemption. And the more I provided for him, the more he sacrificed to the Baals, the more he followed after other gods. And so do you know what I did? I provided even more for him. I demonstrated my love even more, to a greater degree. And I bent down and I took the yoke of slavery off of him. And I lifted him out of that world of of sin and degradation. And yet he goes back to it time and time again. God's love is on display. God's love is being declared for his people through the things that he does for them over and over and over again. And then perhaps the most heartfelt part of this chapter, look at verses 8 and 9. Verse 7, my people are bent on turning from me. How do the people react to God's love? They turn their back on God's love. But verse 8, how can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I surrender you, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart is turned over within me. All my compassions are kindled. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not destroy Ephraim again. For I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath. Try and convince me that God of the Old Testament doesn't love his people. His heart is broken by their sin. He is in agony because of their sin. He has the right of a scorned husband to demand the punishment of a people who have forsaken him. But he says, I won't react with wrath. I won't unleash my anger upon them. I will stir my compassion. I will kindle my kindness. And I will love them no matter what. God's love is constantly on display in the Old Testament. It is constantly demonstrated over and over and over again through the way that he deals with his chosen people. Hosea had the right as a scorned husband to go to his wife and to demand that she be punished according to the law for selling herself back into prostitution after he had rescued her. But Hosea went and he loved her. And he bought her out of slavery once again. And our God has the right as a scorned husband to demand our punishment when we sin. But instead he comes to us with love. And he buys us out of slavery once again. We serve a God of love. That love is also on display in the New Covenant. In all dispensations of time that we have in the Bible, through the patriarchs, through the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, and then on into the New Testament, of course, we have a God who is love. And just a couple of passages, we'll again see more and more of these as we get deeper into the subject over the coming weeks. But John chapter 15, verses 12 through 17, Jesus here is speaking to his disciples really in the final hours of his life. The Last Supper has been eaten. They've already, a time or two, if you read John 13 through 17, there's a couple of times through that reading where Jesus says it's time for us to go because it's time for them to leave the upper room and go to the garden where he's going to be betrayed. And then there's a question or there's something else that comes up and they keep talking. We do that sometimes ourselves, don't we? Where it's like, you're visiting somebody. Well, I guess I better go. And then a half hour later, you're still there visiting. Well, I guess I better be on my way. And we kind of do that as well. So this is during that time when it's like, well, it's time for us to go. But while I got you here, let me tell you this. And so Jesus in John chapter 15 is continuing that discourse. He's continuing that lesson that started with the washing of his disciples' feet, that demonstrated to them his attitude of service and his attitude of humility before them. And so in verses 12 through 17, Jesus says, "This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that they lay down their life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. No longer do I call you slaves, for the slave does not know what his master is doing, but I have called you friends. For all things that I have heard from my Father I have known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you that you should go and bear fruit, and that your fruit should remain, that whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he may give to you. This I command you, that you love one another. I have to be careful with this passage because next quarter we're going to talk about loving one another, so I don't want to give any of that away. So we'll come back to this one again in I don't know, about May sometime probably, where we'll talk about loving one another. But the underlying thing here in this passage is Jesus' declaration of his love for his people, his love for his followers, his love for the disciples. He tells them there at the beginning that they're to love one another just as I have loved you. See, the thing about the difference between the display of love in the Old Testament versus the display of God's love in the New Testament, where sometimes people have this idea that the New Testament is a God of love and the Old Testament is a God of judgment or not a loving God of some kind, is because the demonstration of God's love in the New Testament is so powerful. It is so jarring that to look back and to say, well, why didn't you demonstrate it to us this way earlier? Why didn't you demonstrate it to us this way from the very beginning instead of waiting to demonstrate your love through your Son? Why did you wait, God? Why did you put off this demonstration of your love? Was it because you didn't love us back then? Was it because you weren't sure about whether or not we were worth it? What's going on here, God? Why wait? Well, the time was right. The New Testament tells us the time was right for God to send his Son into this environment. But just because God shows his love differently, because he demonstrates it through his Son in the New Testament, doesn't mean that he didn't love those under the Old Covenant. Doesn't mean that he didn't love before that. God loved his people and always has loved his people. But God has chosen to demonstrate under the new covenant his love for his people through his Son. And it's that final act of love. It's that greatest statement of love that he could make after he has exhausted all other methods, all other possibilities of demonstrating his love for them in such a way so that he could convince them that he was for real, that he could convince them that he was the God that they should serve, that they should follow. And God says, you know what? None of these other ways have demonstrated fully enough. None of these other ways have given you the proper understanding of my love for you. And so there's one more thing that I can do. There's one further tool I have that I can use to express my love for you, and that is to send you my Son. Jesus comes to teach us how to love. I know there's other things we could get into. Jesus came to seek and to save the lost. That was his mission statement. Jesus came to fulfill all of the prophecies. Jesus came to do the Father's will. All of those things are true, but we can't fully describe the life or the ministry or the work of Jesus if we don't include in that a statement of saying that Jesus came here to show us how to love. If we miss that, then we miss God. God is love, and why would we leave that out of our understanding of why Christ came to this earth? Christ came to teach us how to love. And so as we undertake a study of God's love, as we undertake the study to try and figure out what that means that God loves us, we have to study Christ, and we have to study what he did and how he expressed that love for us. There is no greater measure of love than to give up one's life for someone else, and Jesus did that for us. He demonstrated his love for us. And I appreciate the use of Romans chapter 5 in our communion service this morning, and we want to use that again here at the close of this lesson. But the idea of God demonstrating his love under the new covenant is perhaps most fully stated in this passage, Romans chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. For while we were helpless, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will hardly die for a righteous man, though perhaps for the good man someone would dare even to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. See, it's that demonstration of God's love that gets us. It's that idea of not serving a God who sits on a throne a long ways away and calls out to us, "Hey, over there, I love you." But it's a God who comes and lives with us and teaches us and shows us that love through the way that he interacts with us. And then as an exclamation point to that love, to showing us that there's no bounds, there's no end to the love that he has for us, he dies for us. Because that's the only way to save us. God demonstrates his love for us. A love that is undemonstrated, well, is worthless. And it's only through demonstration that love gains power. And God has demonstrated his love for us in the most powerful way that he could conceive. And so what do we do with it? Our call to action, how do we respond to God's love? If we fully grasp it, if we come to an understanding of it, if we accept that God is love and that he has always been love and that he's demonstrated and displayed and declared that love for his people through all time, what do I do with that? Well, I think there are three possible ways that we can react to it. One, we can reject it. You probably know people who have rejected God's love, who reject that there even is a God, or who reject that the idea of a good and loving God is something that they can't accept. When I was in college, one of my best friends, my roommate, was spending time with a young lady, and they got to be pretty close, and he one night declared his love for her. And she didn't feel the same way. And he was heartbroken. Imagine a God who declares his love for you. He demonstrates it. Demonstrates it to the point of sending his son to die for you. And then for you to say, no thanks. I don't need it. I don't feel the same way. See, we can reject God's love. We can try to abuse God's love. And what that looks like is we take that love that God has for us and we sort of sit it on a shelf over here. And when things aren't going the way I want them to go in life, I'm going to go and I'm going to make use of that love that God has for me in a way that, maybe I can get God to give me something out of this deal. He says he loves me. And so if he loves me, maybe he'll help me through this difficult patch that I'm going through, or maybe he'll show me the way to get through what I'm going through. And then as soon as I'm feeling better about life, I'll take that love and I'll sit it back on the shelf over here because I don't really need it when things are going well. We can try that. Have you known people that do that in their marriages or do that in their interactions with other people, where if you have something I need, I'll be pretty friendly to you. But as soon as that resource runs out, or as soon as you stop giving me what I feel like I need, I'm done with you. That's codependence. That's using people. That's abusing a relationship. And it doesn't get you very far in life. We can try that with God, though God doesn't respond well to that. I think we see through examples in the scriptures. Or we can accept it. We can accept God's love. We can accept that God is love and that he has demonstrated his love for us through his son, and we can respond to that love through returning that love to him and obeying him and acknowledging what he has given up in order to demonstrate that love for us. And in that giving, that it has cost him something to love us. And that if it's going to cost him something to love us, maybe our love for him should cost us something as well. Maybe it should cost us living according to our own will. Maybe it should cost us to the point of saying, I'll do as you've asked me to do. Because you showed me your love, now I want to show you my love through the way that I live for you. How do you respond to God's love? What are you going to do with the love that God has demonstrated for you? That's the question we need to think about, not just today, but every day as we live our lives. If you have any need this morning, if you'd like to talk more about God's love or how you can respond to God's love, then we want to continue that conversation as long as we need to. If you will come while we stand and sing.